I want to introduce a gentleman named Eddie Sonnell. And Eddie is, I don't mean to knock it at all, but he's a self-proclaimed futurist, but he's also a technology background and leadership in tech and so forth. I connected with Eddie through the Outdoor Retailer Organization. Eddie has spoken at 2 previous shows at OR, the past 2 shows, and he's booked for the next 2 shows. It's a big environment there for sure, but I have also gotten feedback from some of my brand friends who had the opportunity to hear about Eddie's presentation or see him personally, that he's got some things to say, and the things are pretty, I think, pretty striking for us all. The other thing that I did when Eddie and I first met a couple months ago, I said, Eddie, you've got a very general sort of outdoor industries perspective. What can we do to help you dive in and learn a little bit about paddle sports? And so he did a survey, he's got some feedback from that. And as you know, you probably, if you haven't met him yet, you've probably seen him around because he's walking around the show and talking to you all. So hopefully what we're going to see is something that can also highlight what's going on in our world. But Eddie, I'm looking forward to hearing what you got to say. Eddie Sonnell.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to hold this here so you all hear me. I'm going to sit.
Do you want a podium?
No, I think I'm good. Okay. What I've decided to do is I've got a presentation, but I'm not going to display it. I'm just going to sort of talk through, and then I'm going to leave that QR code up as well as the URL so you can get it from there. And there's a ton of learning and homework for you to do from that link as well, and I'll go through that. Okay, so as a futurist, essentially what I'm trying to do is figure out where the proverbial hockey puck is going to be. And then figure out how to get myself there to take advantage of it. That's really all I do. So in the context of this presentation, I want to try and go through some of those things we do that I see coming down the pipe that as an industry that we need to consider. Some challenges, but as well as some really positive things. Okay? A little background on me. So I'm really actually a brand builder, an entrepreneur. With partners, I built a social network that I sold, and then we did 2 food brands, education product company. At the moment, I co-own a pet business, a telecom tower leasing business, and I've started a SaaS business developing technology for emerging business models for the outdoor industry. And I'll get into that a little bit. Along the way, I've crashed 2 companies, lost my money, lost investors' money, which really sucked. Tried my hand at angel investing. That was a disaster, so I won't do that again. So, like in context of my skill set, I'm really a leading edge technologist. I work with emerging business models and I develop exponential growth strategies. So kind of in that context, you know, that predisposes me to thinking about the future a lot, what I'll be doing. But it was more passive. So it was starting about 2017 where I wanted to try and make sense of the chaos that was going on and be a lot more intentional about what I'm investing my time in, my money, my skill set, my career. So I just began to do a lot more research and began to sort of develop my own frameworks and methodologies for thinking about the future and how to manage that. Coming forward a little bit, in 2022, that's when I want to start my SaaS company because I recognize there's some emerging technology that I think could really revolutionize this industry. So I want to start a company behind that to try and help build that. But I thought, a great way to actually talk about the technology is to teach people about the future, like I taught myself. So I started publishing my works. Everything's on my website. It's all free. I've got predictions and action plans. My frame of reference is the future in context of brands. So, anyone that sells to a consumer, that's what I try and focus my futurist work on. So 2023, I started speaking at events. I started applying. People started inviting me, and since then I've done more events. I'm now starting to speak with groups, do webinars, any kind of group, whether it's C-suites, companies, nonprofits. So this is a subject that's really passionate with me, that people understand what's coming down the pipe and how we can manage that. Okay? All right, so that's pretty much my background. What I want to do now is switch, and let's start with discussing really big picture, over decades. I want to give you a real sense of kind of where we've been and where things are going. So, really starting about 5 years ago, we came out with fantastic research that suggests that as a culture, we move in 80 to 100 year cycles, 80 to 100 years, and then we repeat. So this cycle that we're sort of coming into an end on began right at the end of World War II, and then so now we're sort of running through the end of this cycle. So the previous cycle ended at the Depression of World War II and started at the end of the Civil War. And then the previous cycle to that started at the end of the American Revolution and then ended at the Civil War. So essentially the cycle is as a culture, as a nation, we undergo a great transformation, a great struggle that we triumph. And then we come out of that, we're successful, we grow, we mature, we succeed, but then over time, as the external environment changes, we tend not to change, and then we get complacent. We forget about the struggle, and then we begin to get apathetic, which creates conflicts and stress, which causes us to re-enter the struggle again, to fix our problems, fix things going on with respect to the external environment. And as we get through that struggle, then we triumph and we start a new era. So in that context, where are we now? So if you look back at the Anglo-American era, if you will, for the last 500-600 years, we're now at the end of the 5th era. So we've had 3 as a country and then 2 before that. Right now, since we're at the end of this era, we are naturally have entered sort of the stage where it's difficult, where there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of conflict, and we're right at the beginning of that, unfortunately. So if you can look back at the Depression of World War II and you see how stressful and transformative that was, do the same, look back to the Civil War and the American Revolution. Unfortunately, what we got ahead of us is going to be no less stressful, no less chaotic, no less transformative. But history suggests with this country is that we come out of that stronger, better, we continue to grow and succeed, and we've already done it 5 times. So there's ample data to suggest we are going to do it again, and I'll get into this a little bit, but we've got sort of the base of the assets to do that again, and I firmly believe that we will, and I'll get more into that a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of like a really big picture, kind of the cycle sense. What I want to do is stay on this track about, getting past our troubles in the success period, because I really want you to kind of drill into yourself the potential that we have, the assets that we have to succeed. So even though we've got a lot of great challenges, and I'm going to present those, I really want you to understand, what's going to pull us out and what's going to carry us forward. First thing, so hang on, let me look at my notes here because I can't remember everything. So, okay, research that we found is that there are 7 areas for success for a country to succeed. Number 1 is demographics. 2 is access to natural resources. 3 is a vibrant consumer markets. 4 is wealth. 5 is military strength. 6 is infrastructure. And infrastructure really more dealing with power generation. And 7 is educated population. If you look at all those characteristics, there is only one country that stands far and above ahead out of everyone else. You can probably guess it's the United States. We're in a class all our own from that perspective. There's only 5 other countries that might be a distant second. This might surprise you a little bit. UK, Sweden, France, Turkey, maybe Turkey, possibly India. It's not China. Unfortunately, China, we think of it as a strong country, but they got far deeper problems. They may be imploding in the next decade. But when I say strength, I mean, there's a lot of countries that will do well, like Canada will do well, Mexico will do well, Colombia. Australia. But when I say strength, it's the ability for a country to truly direct its destiny, without too much effect from other countries. Yes, we'll get affected by other countries, but we truly have all these set of characteristics to drive our destiny. And no one can match us on that perspective. So you have to kind of look at those assets as our core. It's like a super center of gravity that we can really rely on to drive this country forward. So as we kind of come to the end of this 5th era and we're starting the 6th era, so what's going to power us with our success moving forward? The first thing is that we've really come to the realization over the last 5 to 10 years that as a country we have to reindustrialize. We did that after World War II, and then starting in the 70s we started to deindustrialize. I'll get into that a little bit, and it really picked up speed in the 1990s. But we've recognized the power of having an industrial base. And for us, that's almost like a new frontier for us to grow into. When you couple that with the need to electrify, that's enormous. So you think of all the equipment to reindustrialize and electrify that we have to build, that we have to install. That's a huge driver in growing an economy. Next is we're right at the dawn of artificial intelligence, which is going to be extremely transformative in a positive way for this country. When you fuse that with robotics, now it's not just robotics for a plant, that you need to automate. We have a labor problem, we don't have enough, so it's going to help that. But you think about robotics in restaurants, in retail, and having micro-retail. There could be a micro-retail boom. You think of robotics that we desperately need in healthcare. If everyone's been on the receiving or giving end of home health for someone who's sick, we need that at home. It's possible in 3 years, I'm thinking more 5, we'll all be able to lease robots like we do with our cars and have them around our house. So, and that's all being driven by AI. So when you sort of look at the background of the ability to produce all of those goods and services around the industrialization, that's enormous. That's an enormous driver of the economy. It feels to me like we're almost at the end of World War II, 1945, where we took all of that industrial know-how from the war and applied it to the consumer economy. We're kind of back at the same situation. But in this case, these are brand new technologies that we're building, and we're having to reindustrialize our country. So that is an enormous driver towards this economy. And that's essentially going to be the new frontier, if you will, that's going to allow us to start growing again. Because really the last 10 to 15 years, it's been relatively stagnant in this economy. Okay, so as we sort of get into this what I call resurgence period, you'll find because as a country we're in a class all our own with kind of leading in those 7 key areas, the US is going to do this, but as we find with the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is actually going to start to do this. Many parts will deindustrialize. We've got issues with resource constraints, but that's not so with the US. So we'll find here is that as we start to grow and as our economy starts to really pick back up, the world's wealth is going to want to come here. They already do. They're going to want to come here even more. They're going to want to sell to us even more. We're already the world's consumer market. Most other countries built export machines to sell to us, but they never developed their economies. So when we have that, we can dictate on our terms for other countries. We'll find that people want to come here. The smart people want to come here. So when you sort of look at all those things, at this point, we're going to be able to drive that, and countries are going to be giving us concessions. Whereas, at the end of World War II and in the 50s, we were giving concessions to countries to get them into the Western Bloc, because at that time we had the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Not so now. Yes, we still have sort of a new Cold War that's developed with what we call the axis of rogues, which is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But they do not have the assets that we do. They do not have the strength. In many respects, they're imploding very quickly. So they are still going to present problems. They're going to present challenges. But when you really look at it, I mean, many people say that the age of America was the 20th century, but really it's going to be this century. It's going to be the age of America. I think the last piece is, in terms of the resurgence growth, there are experts saying that we could see 6 to 8% GDP growth per year. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, long term, our growth is 3%. But with everything that I just told you, we have the potential to really exceed that and really succeed as a country. Okay, what I want to do now is sort of shift into the challenges. This is a tough section because I'm not going to sugarcoat things for you. Like, we have significant challenges. And I'm going to rip the proverbial Band-Aid off, okay? I'm not a perma bear. I'm actually tremendously optimistic. But I hope you can understand, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, and every one of you is in this camp, like, I want to know what I'm dealing with. Like, I want to get it out on the table, because when you can define the problem, then it's a lot easier to define the solution behind that. Okay? So let's kind of get into the section now of sort of talking about our challenges that I see between now and the next 10 years. Number one is that as World War II closed, we had two enormous benefits in this country. Number one, we had fantastic demographics. And if you look at demographics, there's what's called a population pyramid, which, you know, looks like this as a pyramid. That's what we had. That's what you want. Number two is we had what I call is a proverbial empty room that was ready to be filled with products and services that, you know, in 1945, we never imagined what we've accomplished today. So when you sort of look at demographics in an empty room, what we did is we built our economy, not just our economy, but we marshaled the world to essentially build anything and everything at any time at the lowest cost possible. So we built an amazing manufacturing machine to fill that room. And if you look at it now, it's really quite amazing what we did. I mean, if you look at all the products and all the services, the gadgets that we own, the discretionary items, the creativity that we have in our economy, we did really amazing things as a country, and we marshaled the world behind that. You know, because I said, we are the world's consumer market. But along the way, there's other things that we did to sort of eke out more growth. I already mentioned that we started to deindustrialize. That started in the 70s, and that by doing that, it's lowered costs and products, so it wasn't all bad. In the last 20 years, our government has spent a lot more than it's earned. I'll get into that a little bit. But that has been another way to really stoke our economy and to continue to, you know, pull as much out and fill that room as we can. We had a great monetary policy from the Federal Reserve that gave us low rates. So again, that was all stoking more growth, getting us more efficient. In the 1970s, we started to change laws that lowered taxes towards the wealthy. That helped in many ways because the wealthy reinvested. We got more productivity, we got more products, we got more services. And we obviously got very good at extracting resources between agriculture and mining and creating all these wonderful things that we have now. Okay, but there were consequences to doing all that. So let's go through some of that. You know, the analogy that I look for is that, you know, we had great demographics and we had an empty room. But now that room is full. You know, over 80 years of building a super efficient manufacturing machine that gave whatever you wanted, pretty much whenever you wanted, at the lowest cost possible. Like, we filled that room. Okay, I mean, we did what we set out to do. In the course of the deindustrialization, so we began to lose our blue-collar class, which really ate into our middle class. When you really look at the last 50 years, who got the American dream was largely knowledge-based white-collar workers. Who was left behind were blue-collar workers. They didn't get the American dream. That's almost 50% of the US. That's a big consequence that we saw. We've seen tremendous wealth imbalances build. So in the US, if you look over hundreds of years, we have periods like in the 1920s and 30s, just like today, we had tremendous wealth imbalance. But at the time, the political leaders and the wealth class got together and restructured and realized that we needed to fix that. And they changed laws to essentially create a middle class. So if you see over from the 1930s to the 70s, wealth inequality dropped, but starting in the 70s, it started to pick back up. So we're now at the level where we were in the 1930s. So you can argue we got a lot of benefits to wealthy people and they reinvested, but the consequences is that we've really eroded the middle class and that we have tremendous wealth inequality, which really is the source for a lot of our political polarization that you see now. It's because part of the country got the American dream, the other part didn't. And along the way, starting 20 years ago, as a country, we've now built massive debt. So this is an analogy I like to talk about to bring that home. Imagine that you make $100,000 a year, but for the last 20 years, you've been spending $130,000 a year. So over the course of those 20 years, your lifestyle has revolved and has been built around that $130K spend when you only make 100, and now you've incurred $700,000 in debt. Okay, just add a lot of zeros, and that is the state of the U.S. government right now, which is fairly extreme. The problem with that is it's so extreme. It's not like we were spending 5% extra a year. On average, we're doing 30% extra a year. So the problem is that really over the last 10 years, our economy has been structured around that extra spend. So if we have to take that spend away, imagine if you had to take $30,000 spend out of your lifestyle, that'd be a shock. And no, it wouldn't my household. And that's where we stand with the US. At some point, we have to take that spend away. And unfortunately, it may create a shock to this system because our economy has been structured around that. Okay, so I kind of covered through like the blue collar, the wealth imbalances. We've incurred a lot of environmental destruction along the way. We see that via climate change. Hang on a minute here. So essentially the nature is moving forward, like as a country, we built the machine to fill the empty room. Many of us prospered and we did very well. But we built a lot of imbalances along the way. So we're now at a point where we have to really correct those imbalances. Number one is we need to find a new frontier to essentially sell to so we can all prosper. And that's being built. When you think about the reindustrialization and everything going on with artificial intelligence, that's being built. But the problem is that we continue to have these imbalances that we're not addressing. So, the room is stuffed and it's like sitting precariously at the end of a cliff. And it's almost like we need to have this new frontier come online so that we can afford to fix all these imbalances, but it's not coming online fast enough. So we're kind of leading to a position where we might have some shock moments where sort of things fall apart, which means it's going to really impact this economy severely. Which means we'll have to adjust. But as I said, we'll come out of that. But it's just getting from where we are now through what I call that reckoning period into the resurgence side. Okay, so that's the macro picture, okay? I want to dive a little into the outdoor industry. So sort of in context of where we stand as a country in the US, there's three areas that I'm really concerned about that could decimate this industry. Number one is that the last 20 years, this industry has really been built on discretionary sales. And, the number's been kicked around a lot that this industry is about 70% of it, the revenue, drives off discretionary sales. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but either way, discretionary spending by the recreational consumer is a huge driver of this industry. As we get into deep or troubling economic periods, if we have a deep recession, that discretionary spending goes away. Okay, and so that could decimate this industry. I think number two is let's look at public lands funding. When you look at the prioritized list of this country's federal budget and our requirements, so at the top you have to pay interest expense on this debt, which is about 25%. Below that we have defense spending, and then under that we have Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and then under all that you have what's called discretionary spending, which is where public lands land. That's where they get their funding from. So if you're in a position right now where we have to cut the budget or we're not able to incur more debt to spend, and so we hit that wall, essentially we cannot cut interest expense on the debt. We're not cutting defense spending because we're living in a much more precarious world. And so defense spending is going to go up. We're not going to cut Medicare and Medicaid because people that are on that don't want to cut that. So that leaves discretionary spending. If we don't make cuts to those initial areas and always say, okay, let's cut discretionary spending, we have to cut that 78% to get a balanced budget. That's extreme. Can you imagine public lands and their budget getting cut 78%? I'm not saying that'll happen. I don't know. But is it reasonable to conclude that's 10, 20, 30%? Yes. And that's my concern, is that when I sort of look at one of the pillars of this industry, it's open and accessible public lands. But if we can't afford it and we have to close them, what does that do for this industry that relies on that? Okay, so the third thing that really concerns me, that I think could decimate this industry, is if we see worsening economic conditions, we see recessions come into play. Consumers will gravitate towards secondary market or e-commerce sales. We're already seeing those platforms skyrocket in growth. But the platforms that are growing are what's called peer-to-peer third-party platforms. So these are not the ones that brands set up. They're actually not really working. The ones that are working largely are eBay, Craigslist, and Meta Marketplace. So if consumers are now, because of the economy, they're trying to reduce costs, so they've now migrated to secondary platforms to buy used products. Brands get no revenue from those networks. So my concern is that brands on average get 98% of their revenue from producing and selling new products. If that is severely cut, 40, 50, 60%, but think of the chain that affects brands, that affects the retailers, that affects media companies, that affects trade shows like this. So, like when you look at public lands and brands, they're kind of like two of the four backbones of this industry. The other two are obviously retailers and media companies. So my concern is that if we have those kinds of deep economic issues nationally, consumers are going to migrate towards used platforms, not buying new products. Okay. Let me just quickly go through a number of other issues in this industry that I see as problematic. Number one is resource constraints. As we enter a world where it's getting harder to get resources, we may not be able to have them to produce products. Resource constraints means higher inflation, means higher costs. A lot of our product development has been evolutionary, not revolutionary. So products produced 20 years ago are just as good, so it's hard to motivate consumers to upgrade. There really has been no new innovations in marketing and sales, so consumers are bored. If you look at the last 20 years of the internet, like every single company, whether it's a startup or a large company, pretty much has access to the same tools, same ways to market, and consumers are bored with that. Regulations are increasing, largely because of climate change. I mean, whatever side fence that you're on, what we've done so far has not worked. Okay, we've destroyed our environment, climate change continues to get more catastrophic, so you're going to see a lot more regulations from governments forcing companies to pay attention to that. Subscription models have been diminishing the experience, so like I use open snow to ski, and when we find powder days, it used to be great, there's no one there, but now everyone sees that there's a powder day, so it's too crowded, so now you have to avoid it. Another big issue is that the outdoor industry is losing to activities with stronger dopamine addictions. What do I mean by that? Best analogy is you play a sport that gives you dopamine hits. You watch a sport that's quicker, faster dopamine hit. Now you gamble on the sport. So our online economy has progressed where consumers, particularly young people, are gravitating more towards doing things that give them bigger dopamine hits. So we don't see a lot of participation, or we see less participation in the outdoor industry from like millennials and Gen Z. Okay, so kind of let me start to wrap up a little bit on a few things. So where are we at now? So I kind of gave you a big picture overview, of our cycles. I discussed some of the really good stuff though that we need to look forward to. But then I kind of went through some of the bad stuff, sort of macro level. 3 things that I think could decimate this industry that I'm concerned about, and a plethora of other challenges that we're faced with. So how does this sort of work things out on a timing perspective over the next 10 years? Okay, there's 2 characteristics of the American population that is really important for you to understand. So number 1 is that before we act to fix problems, things need to get really, really bad. So unfortunately, things I think are going to get a lot worse when you look at our economy, when you look at climate change, when you look at our societal polarization. Like, we are not at the stage yet where things are so bad that we're willing to put our differences aside to work together, okay? A lot of that is just a factor of we don't want to sacrifice. Hey, I'm okay with the change, but you take the pain. And we all think that, so we don't do anything. And that's the state of our political economy. Number 2, actually a lot of people in this economy in this country are doing fine. They want it to stay as is. And that tends to skew towards older, wealthier, and they're the ones generally in leadership positions. They're okay with changing as long as they don't feel the pain, or they want to do it slowly, whereas we're in a position now where we have to make quick changes. It's not happening fast enough. And number 3 is the biggest thing about this country is that we actually need shock moments to change. So think of at the dawn of World War II. We had already been through almost 15 years of the Depression. We were, as a country, economically broken. We were demoralized. We were insular. We were trying to avoid involvement in world affairs. And then at that point, the Axis powers knew we were on the ropes. So from their perspective, the decisive blow would have been Pearl Harbor. But in fact, it wasn't, because that ended up being a shock moment that essentially poked the bear, if you will. It got us to turn around, finally take the gloves off, and do what we need to do to succeed. Now, you think about that. We had 15 years of just miserable existence in this country before that. But then from Pearl Harbor to winning World War II, that was only 3.5 years. I mean, as a country, we turned it around that quickly, and we have that capability. So we seem to respond more to shock moments. And there's been a lot since then. Think of Sputnik, which galvanized our space program. Think of the Vietnam War. Massive changes in our military. Think of the Gulf War. Think of Twin Towers. I mean, I'm not saying things that we did afterwards are right or wrong. I'm just saying those are shock moments that finally got us to see that we got to take the gloves off and we got to fix these problems. So unfortunately, that's really, whether you call it a future bug of this country, that's the state. Things are going to have to get a lot worse. We're going to have to see maybe one or several shock moments to get us, to galvanize us into action. Now, I don't know where they're going to come from. It could be just simply financial. We hit the wall because we can't incur more debt. It could be China invades Taiwan, which estimates are that would drop our GDP 7%. It could be some environmental catastrophe or a series of, I don't know. But history, looking through all of the past eras for this country, we need those shock moments to really galvanize us. Okay, so what does that sort of put us at timing? My sense is that we're in a period where the economy is sort of anemic. It'll start to climb out a little bit, I think, over the next couple of years. But then we may need to expect shock moments somewhere in the 2028 to 2032 period. So that's the period where you have to just sort of be cognizant that we might have major change at that point. We'll get those shock moments, it'll galvanize us, it'll start to turn us around, and then we start to enter the resurgence period. We start to really do what we need to do and rely on our assets to climb out of our debt situation, to fix our imbalances. We'll find at that point that this new frontier that we're rebuilding in reindustrialization is much further along, so that's going to be able to really be able to re-energize the economy. Okay. Okay, let me shift here. I don't have much time left, so you know, sort of as an entrepreneur, like my thinking is, well, that's great. Like it's really intellectually satisfying to like understand all this, and I do voracious amounts of reading, and I read from a lot of other futurists. But like at the end of the day, it's like, how is this going to help me? What do I do with this for my businesses? So there's a couple things that I just want to run through, and I want to really stick with the standpoint of my wheelhouse, which is emerging technologies, emerging business models, and exponential growth strategies. Okay, number one is for this industry, for paddle sports, my sense is, and here I want to sort of address a few elephants in the room, you know, which is the conflict between large and small brands, conflict between DTC and retail, the conflicts arising from commoditization and discounting. My sense is, like, what's a little unique for this industry is that there may be a way to turn those conflicts around into strengths or into an assets. So if you consider, like, you know, the what I call the marketing ascension funnel, you know, this is sort of a well-known funnel where, you know, to acquire customers, you do awareness marketing up here, and then as they start to learn about you, you kind of bring them in to know about your company. You convert them into buyers. Okay, so now you have them as a buyer. And then now, since you have them as a customer, you want to send them up your value chain. So you want them to buy more products and services from you. That's called value ascension. So if you think about it from that context, you want to sort of figure out where you fit and who's adjacent to you, and then how you might be able to work with them so that you can move that buyer through. John with Confluence Kayak said yesterday he would go into REI, he would talk to them, and they would give him referrals. That's exactly that same model. I think this industry isn't that big, and you could do that. You could probably have that organized through PTC, you know, where you've got the large manufacturers talking with your smaller ones as well as your specialty retailers, and figuring out how to move that buyer through. So instead of competing, you all sort of figure out where you are, and you compete sort of in that area that you're good at, and then you leave the other stuff to someone else. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. Again, I wrote this up in my presentation. I've got a lot more tools around this for you to consider that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about technology. I talked about some of the decimation factors. One is public lands. There's actually emerging technology, an emerging business model that could help counteract some of that. I don't want to get into specifics, but this might interest retailers, you know, or, you know, local guides or instructors. If you rely on a public land in your area to stay open, to be accessible, to be maintained, this is something that you might want to get involved with, because this is a way of increasing stewardship, conservation, and funding of public lands coming from consumers. Okay? That's in the presentation. I'll leave that so that you guys can go into that. What I would offer, though, is that let's put a group together of retailers or anyone that's involved in local public land, and we can understand that technology, build it out, or at least think it through before we roll it out to this group. So not something you want to do on your own. We've got to work together on this. Okay, let's talk about the decimation I talked about with brands not being able to sell a new product. There is emerging technology, an emerging business model that will allow a brand to get 2% of the revenue on a used sale no matter where it happens. So imagine, well, 2% isn't much, but that flows directly to your bottom line. It goes right to net income. So that may be a way of counteracting the lost sales you have from new products, but they're happening on the secondary market, okay? Same thing, I won't go into details, but I suggest that we pull a small group together of manufacturers, that we look at the standards, adapt them, figure out a plan of how to roll this out, and present that to the group, okay? Not something we want to do individually. This would take an industry-wide initiative. So that's how I would suggest what we do moving forward. Okay, so I'm about out of time. There's other stuff I want to cover, but I want to just quickly sort of run through your homework, because I've only presented 2 or 3 things, and I've got about 80 or 90 things that I could talk through, but that's in the homework for you. So if you see the link that's posted, the QR code, or you just see that link, on that page will be the video of this presentation. I'll speech to text it. I've got my presentation. I've got links to a ton of other resources that I'd really like you guys to spend some time on. Again, my perspective is building brands, so I do all this stuff as a brand builder. So I create a lot of tools and frameworks and models that I think can really help you. You just have to spend some time on that. Okay, so make sure you go to that link to do that. There's a number of other things that I offer, so I'm starting to do an email that I send out quarterly that updates people on the future, because it's constantly changing, so you can subscribe to that. These presentations, I don't charge for these. I do these for free. My business model is not to earn money off of this. I pay my way to shows like this. I can't travel to everything, but I can certainly do webinars. So if you want me to do something for your company, or for your C-suite, or your department, or you've got another group, let's do it. Schedule me. Use my content, but if you want me to talk that through, I'm happy to do that. Okay, so I think 1 or 2 final thoughts, and I'm done. My perspective moving forward is that to succeed, and you sort of look at this from the perspective of the history of this country, is we do really well and succeed when we work together. Okay, I presented a couple of concepts to you. I wanted to get through 7 or 8 more, but every one of those, I'm telling you, we have to work together. Okay, you can't figure out technology, you can't figure out AI, we can't do these new initiatives on our own. Okay, we can't duplicate things internally. We have to work together as a group. So, take the opportunity at this conference and literally, put your name down for some new initiative that someone wants to do. Okay, I'm really trying to bias you all towards action at this point. Don't wait for Jeff or the board, don't throw it on them. Don't say, hey, well, let's see how it works, and then we'll decide. Get involved now. Okay, so I really encourage you to cooperate as a group, because that's how we succeed. Okay, the last thing is that, in the same vein of this cooperation, in this country right now, there's a lot of what I call personal suffering on an individual level. We see it. There's a lot of stress and uncertainty moving forward about a lot of things that I talked about. You see a lot of substance abuse issues. You see, particularly with our young people, enormous issues around suicide. It's just astronomical, the numbers that we're seeing. And I think a lot of that has to do because we're trying to compete against each other. So what I offer to you is that we can't leave anyone left behind, was I'm saying, moving forward, as we sort of get into this resurgence. So don't be transactional. When you contact someone, you expect something from them. What I'd rather you do is that begin to contact people in your network to try and help each other. Contact someone and say, hey, I was thinking about you. How are you doing? What can I do to help? You notice in business is that we only contact each other if we want something. But if we start to do this, we start to reach people. We start to help each other. Okay? So, the last 2 pieces then is let's cooperate, because that's how we succeed, and leave no one behind. Okay? I'm out of time, so Thank you very much to Jeff and the board for inviting me. Thank you all for listening to me. This has been a real privilege. If you have questions, I'm here through the end of the day. I'd love to have more conversations with you. I'm pretty accessible. You can always contact me. And again, I offer, like, if you've got a group or want to talk more, want to have me present, let's get that scheduled. Okay? Thank you all.
Everyone. Thank you, Eddie. That was unbelievable.